How did the Viking invasions reshape Europe? All right, first, my counter thesis. Here's a quote from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In this year, dire forewarnings came over the land of the Northumbrians and miserably terrified the people. The havoc of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church. End quote. And then here's a quote from Dr. Parker. While the intense terror and violence of the Viking raids is the key to why they're remembered and studied today, this overlooks the complex ways in which they impacted European life in ways that had nothing to do with their violent attacks on Christian institutions and other easily destroyed targets. All right, end quote. So that's the counter thesis. Here's the thesis. The Vikings' innovative strategies in colonization of the continent shifted the political center of gravity from southern to northern Europe. First, by the ending of the Carolingian domination of northern Europe. Second, by the reshaping of the map from Vikings settling and founding new kingdoms throughout Europe. And third, the Vikings transformed European culture by transmitting their culture through their literature, technological innovation, and trade. All right, my first point. They helped hasten the decline of the Carolingian domination of northern Europe. So, first, the Viking era lasted from 789 to 1066, in which the Battle of Hastings took place. During that time, European culture had an immense shift because of these Vikings, and then the stage was set at the end of the Viking era for the subsequent eras, including the era of exploration came after that. So the Vikings played a key role in heading the world to the next step. Notker the Stammerer is one of the numerous biographers of Charlemagne, and he tells us one of the earlier known Viking raids. So Charlemagne is in this seaside town in the south of Gaul, and while he's dining, presumably these ships come into their port and start attacking, and there's disagreements amongst the people as to what type of ships they are. Traders, merchants, no one knows, but Charlemagne, Noker tells us, thought that they were Viking ships or Northmen ships because of the way they looked and how fast they were going. So it was kind of too late. They made their attack and got out fast. Charlemagne pursued them with his ships, but it was too late. They could not outsail the Viking ships. And then Notker tells us that Charlemagne wept. And then Notker records Charlemagne saying, quote, "I am not afraid that these ruffians will be able to do to me any harm, but I am horror-stricken when I foresee what evil they will do to my descendants and their subjects," end quote. So that was the beginning of the end for the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne would, throughout the rest of his reign, experience more of these Norsemen or Northmen. And these Danes, according to the annals of Fudla, I don't know how you say it, they were, quote, the most powerful people among the Northmen, end quote, and would become the major enemy to the Frankish Empire until its downfall. Charles the Fat was, sadly and unfortunately, the last emperor of the Carolingian dynasty. He gained most of his land by a series of unfortunate deaths, and then was unable to withstand Viking attacks, and so he was deposed from the throne. So that proves my point that the Vikings kind of ended the Carolingian dynasty. On to the next point. They reshaped the map by settling and establishing new kingdoms throughout Europe. Okay, so the Vikings were major explorers. They got around everywhere. According to Michael Lamoureux, quote, "The Vikings were the preeminent explorers of their time," end quote. And while they were doing all their exploring, they settled little towns along the way, since you have to live somewhere. So one of these little towns is Dublin, and others that kind of shifted the political or social centers to these cities where the Vikings were settling. Dublin is one of them, like I said, and Dublin, the city, bears still the marks of being of Viking descent. Dr. Parker told us just 3 of the places that he lived when he lived there. I don't remember the names of them, but they all had the prefix, or like Hroth, which came from a town or settlement near there called Hrother. And it's just interesting that Dublin still bears those marks. And our language still bears the marks of Vikings. Mainly the words that we can trace back to Old Norse are battle words, unsurprisingly. Words like ransack, gun, club, scathe, slaughter, and interestingly, berserk. Berserk is an interesting one. In Old Norse, it means bare shirt. It referred to a berserk guy, basically, that would go into battle and all he was wearing for armor was a bear shirt, or like an animal skin. Pretty interesting how we still retain that. On to my third point. They transformed Europe with their technological innovation, literature, and trade. Okay, so we tend to think of the Vikings only in terms of their violent raids, but no. They brought many important technological innovations with them to Southern Europe. They had they did have good weaponry since they used it for their raids. Cool, like, carbon swords and stuff you can learn about. But they also had very advanced ships, which improved their trading abilities and improved... and they had good trading and awesome construction. Actually, Viking construction is really interesting. Some Viking buildings still stand today, in fact. There's this really interesting building. It's this wooden church. It's made only out of wood. There's, like, even what they use for, like, a nail is a wooden little dowel or peg or whatever. And it's standing up, like, on top of a fjord where you can imagine it gets horrible weather. Wind, rain, snow, sleet, hail, storms, lightning, thunder, everything. And it's made out of wood and it's been standing there for 1,000 years. And it's still in good condition, which is pretty amazing. So you think of the Vikings as being nomadic and, like, barbarians, but they knew how to construct lasting buildings, which is really interesting and cool. Here's a quote from Michael Lamoureux, quote, "Their craftsmen were highly skilled and capable of producing pine blades, sometimes pattern welded, that were designed for long use," end quote. I don't know what those words mean, but apparently it means that they were really good craftsmen. Okay, so... on to the next part. Viking literary innovation had a strong effect on culture. So, these Icelandic sagas are really interesting and cool, and according to Ben Myers, quote, "The Icelandic sagas still influence the way we tell and read stories today," end quote. So that's interesting. The rest of that quote talks about how we might think of Homer as being a saga similar to this, but really, Homer is more fantastical, like, and less relatable. Like, it's very interesting to read, but you don't really relate to Odysseus as in his state of life. Like, he's a prince and kind of king, but the people that are in these Icelandic sagas are just regular people that might actually have existed, that are much more relatable to the average, to, like, regular Joe who wants to read a saga. Which is really interesting that we still kind of appreciate that outlook on storytelling now. Alright, onward. Their commercial innovations. Okay, so we talked about how good Vikings were at making ships. Well, what did they use their ships for? They used them for traveling around and trading all over everywhere, pretty much. Their trade route was immense. They traded all over Europe. Let's see, where's my list? Europe, Russia, the Middle East, India, and even China. Can you imagine having to row one of those boats all the way to China? That is crazy. But they were well crafted, so they could do it. And the Vikings were really strong, so they could do it. Alright, so they also were the ones that opened the trading between the Byzantines and Franks, which is interesting. We know about these trade routes because in Viking burial grounds, because Vikings were traditionally buried with their treasures, so we can see, one guy had a treasure that has this certain, like, amber or whatever that would have been in India, so we know that they traded with Indians, which is really interesting. And kind of amazing, and really goes against everything we've learned about Vikings. Even their like, traditional horn hats really just came from a Wagner opera, and that wasn't true. So Vikings were really kind of a detailed and nuanced culture that's interesting to learn about. So in conclusion, The Vikings' innovative strategies and colonization of the continent shifted the political center of gravity from southern to northern Europe. First, by the ending of the Carolingian dynasty, second, by the reshaping of the map, and third, by transforming the culture through their technological innovations, their literature, and trade. Thank you.